Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Depending on when you watch this, I guess. Hope everybody's doing well and going with the season ramping up here. We're all about to get super busy, so good luck with that. So let's just dive right in. Today we're going to talk about managing soil-borne diseases, and Jim and I thought it would be good to kind of go over some of the a big part of what we do here at NC State is a diagnostics lab, and that's a big part of what I do in our program. But we thought it'd be important to go over a little bit of the data from that, just to show you why, I think you're going to see real quick that they are the top issues, no matter which type of grass you're managing. So I'm going to show you, some data on why they're, to prove that they are problematic for everybody. And then Jim's going to dive into the management of them. So what I'm going to show you here is mostly from last year, from 2022. But being that you all are mostly, north of us, mid-Atlantic region, we're going to focus primarily on cool season stuff. But I will show you a little bit of warm season just to show you that you all are battling similar issues, believe it or not. All right. So just real quick, just showing you, we receive samples from all over the world actually, but just showing you here in the United States. That we do get samples from more than just the state of North Carolina. When you look at our data here, a couple things. All those states in red that are not North Carolina, that's 98 or 99% putting green samples. It's pretty rare that we get anything from out of state that's not from a putting green, and I think you all understand why, being the industry you're in. So just showing you that, right? If we break it down to just bentgrass POA, we do combine those. And you can see there at the bottom that 86% what we believe to be pure creeping bentgrass. If any of you have ever tried to control POA, you may find out you've got more than you realize, but 86% is pure creeping bentgrass, 9% pure POA, and then 5% mixed. They get a lot of the same diseases, so from our end, we just lump them all together. So that it is all lumped together, so keep that in mind. But just showing you where they come from as far as just bent POA. This is where Bermuda grass comes from, and when I say Bermuda, we're talking about ultra dwarf Bermuda putting surfaces. So I don't think there's any surprise there as far as the regions of our country that the two come from, right? We get this question a lot: is how was last year? Was it did you get a lot of samples? Whatever. On an average year, we get around 420 submissions. And what that means, what that translates to is about 750 to 800 actual plugs of turf grass. So we're a pretty high volume lab. And 85% of that's coming from golf course putting greens. So last year was pretty average, if you will, as far as that goes. As I mentioned, majority of what we get is from golf, from putting greens specifically. You see the lawn care, that's exclusively here in North Carolina. And then we also look at some ornamental grasses for some of our big nurseries here in North Carolina. A little bit of sports turf. Really don't see all that much of that, but we do get a little bit. As far as the host submission distribution, this is across all, so everything, all turf industries. Just to show you, majority of what we look at now is ultra dwarf Bermuda grass. It used to be that creeping bentgrass was #1, and that changed as people converted over the past 10, 15 plus years in our region from bentgrass over to Bermuda. So that would make sense. And then you go on down the line with all the different stuff there. If we look at just putting greens, Bermuda grass is #1. Then you see creeping bent, and then in this case I did separate out pure POA and then bent POA mix. And then you see seashore paspalum, get that from down in Florida, Hawaii, places like that. And then you see poatriv or rough stalk bluegrass, and that's as an overseed in Bermuda grass putting greens. I see a fair amount of that as well, particularly this time of year, from places out west and down south. So that's the breakdown of that. And just real quick, just to show you lawns, I think this has been interesting to watch. With climate change, there's a lot of ways to monitor that. I think there's been plenty of examples through the years with pests moving further north, both insects, diseases, and weeds. but also seeing the shift from cool to warm season grasses in transition zone areas like ourselves here in North Carolina. We used to receive overwhelmingly the majority was tall fescue. So not only in the golf industry do we see that shift, but we do see it in home lawns as well. So we're seeing more warm season grasses going out with zoysia being very popular. So there's a learning curve there with people trying to learn the diseases and how to manage them. So, we see a fair amount of zoysia grass from home lawns. If we look just at putting greens, break it down to cultivars and varieties, I always caution people when you look at this, don't look at this and think that A1, A4, and Champion are disease dogs. It's just a frequency thing, right? If we surveyed everybody, this would probably match pretty close to what's out there. So don't look at it in a negative way. But in creeping bentgrass, the A's have been at the top for quite a while now. The pure distinction, which is fairly new from pure seed, has climbed the ladder pretty quick. I know here in our state, when people are doing renovations or any kind of new construction, pure distinction is pretty common as a top choice. So naturally, we're seeing more of that. And then you can go on down the list with the others. And then in Bermuda grass, we see mostly Champion, but Tiff Eagle is definitely climbing the ladder. The new Champion G12 has climbed the ladder over the past couple of years. And then you can see the rest there as well. If we look at just bent POA putting green submissions, since 2010, they definitely have declined. And as I mentioned earlier, this has everything to do with conversions, right? People converting to Bermuda. So no real surprise there, but it does seem to have leveled out to where about, roughly 40% of what we get now is from those grasses. This slide here is just showing you from 2022 when the samples were submitted. This doesn't change too much. You'll see here in a minute that it did shift a little bit, but the peak activity is during the summer months when those grasses are under the most stress. I doubt that surprises anybody that's watching this. But this is kind of interesting, when we now that we've collected a fair amount of data doing this with our new database that we started back in 2008 here at NC State, we're able to take a 14-year average, which is the total amount of data we have of bent POA submissions. And you see that bell curve where it peaks in the summer, but last year it shifted over by about a month. Instead of peaking in July, it peaked in August. And I remember looking back on those submissions, and that makes sense. That's when most of that's when we were getting inundated with those samples. So a little bit of a slight shift. I don't know if that'll hold up over time or if it was just last year. So now that we have all this data, it will be interesting as we go forward year after year to see how it moves around with the average as far as when the peak problems occur, right? Just showing you all the things we diagnosed last year. Another thing to remember is people tend to send us, stuff that's really hard to identify in the field, often requiring the use of a microscope, or they just want confirmation of what they already know. They may need it in writing or a formal report. But these are all the things that we diagnosed last year, right? So both abiotic and biotic. We have the ability to test for soluble salt, so we will diagnose or report high salt levels. Black layer is pretty easy to diagnose, right? Abiotic issue. And you go on down the line, you see nematodes on the list. We are not a nematode lab. We don't, do assays to provide counts. But there are certain species that we can see, like root knot nematode or lance nematode, that are, inside the roots. And if we see enough of them, I think it's, often pretty obvious that it's an issue. So we do report that, and we often encourage clients to reach out to reputable nematode labs to get a proper assay to start monitoring your populations, so on and so forth. But so a wide variety of things here, foliar and soil-borne, but we'll get into that more as we move on. If we just break it down to the top 10, just go straight to the bottom and look at no pathogen found. So that always, with bentgrass, that fluctuates between 45 and 55%. Couple things here. Once again, remember, people are sending us turf that's not behaving, if you will. So there are a lot of things that cause turf to decline. So keep that in mind, both abiotic and biotic. Don't always assume it's a disease. And if you do get a diagnosis back of no pathogen found, that's just as important, if not more important, than being diagnosed with a terrible disease. And I always say that's one of the hardest phone calls to make, is that we didn't find anything, because it still leaves you wondering what the heck's going on. But do note that it happens. there are labs out there that always find something, and I caution you against using labs like that. So be aware of that, right? But as far as the top one, Pythium root rot, that one's always at the top. Soil-borne disease. It gives people the biggest headache with these grasses. Hopefully with the new products, well, we've had Segway for a while. Now you have Serrata. I think Jim will touch on that later a little bit, but with the tools we have now, hopefully that'll fade over time. You see an abiotic issue, high soluble salts up there, right? Summer patch, another soil-borne issue. Fairy ring, another soil-borne issue. Black layer, technically a soil-borne abiotic issue. I think you see the picture there, right? So those are the top problems that people face year after year with these grasses. If we do a chronology of it, so when you look at this is just 2022. When you see a little square or rectangle, it just means we received a few samples. And then when you see a long bar, that means we were getting lots and lots of samples during that time frame, right? So that's always interesting to look at. It kind of helps you better visualize when the symptoms appear for these things. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the best time to spray for them. And Jim will talk about that when he talks about the management of these things. But this is when the symptoms appear and people send the samples off. So that's always interesting to look at. And then this was something I did new for last year. We took 10 years worth of data, and this is just in North Carolina. But you would have to adjust maybe a little bit, depending. Our weather is pretty similar to the Mid-Atlantic and across the transition zone, even on out to California, believe it or not, as far as the timing of these things when these diseases occur. But this is a heat map of the chronology, but 10 years worth of data, just showing you the top 10 things that we've diagnosed. With the top one being at the bottom, right, the Pythium root rot. And then depending on how many submissions we've received in those months, it indicates the color, whether it's yellow, orange, or red. So when you see the oranges and reds, that means it is wide open. We're getting a ton of those. It's very common for it to occur during that period. So this is a very neat thing to look at, I think. It kind of helps you visualize your fungicide program and diseases to be on alert for, and so on, right? And then the last thing I'll show you is just real quick, is Bermuda grass. Once again, I know most of you guys don't manage Bermuda, but just to show you that their top two diseases are soil-borne, take-all root rot and Pythium root rot. So very similar situation there. But as Jim gets into the management part of it, I think you'll have a better understanding of why there are issues and some tips and tricks to overcome those challenges. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Kerns.
Fantastic. So now that everybody knows what the problems are, let's see if we can figure out how to manage them. And some of these other root diseases I'll talk about, I decided to focus on Pythium root rot and summer patch because these are two of the most problematic ones for cool season turf grasses, but we'll talk about take-all patch and fairy ring as well as we go through this. So, the key thing we have to understand is, I think we've established that root diseases, I think of the top 10, both in Bermuda grass and bent grass, 50% of them are root issues. So if we're looking to apply a fungicide, how do we optimize those applications? And, as Lee mentioned, getting the disease properly diagnosed is absolutely critical. Work with the lab, the people you actually see who actually present at things like this. These are the ones that, they don't have any skin in the game. They're doing it for a service. So you're going to get an honest answer. And I think that's critically important. One of my biggest entertainments every day is looking at social media sites and looking at diagnoses based on images, because they're all wrong. And how do you manage it if you don't know what you're dealing with? Then from there, we select the appropriate fungicide, and there's a number of resources that can help you do this. There's the Kentucky Fungicide publication. If you just type that into Google, it will come up and it ranks fungicides. Our website, Turf Files, has 29 disease profiles, and we also rank the efficacy of fungicides. So plenty of places to learn how to pick the right fungicide. And then finally, tailor that application method. Fungicides, unlike herbicides and insecticides, are inherently large molecules. So as such, they're very sticky. They're hard to move through turf grass and through soil. So if we're managing a root disease, we have to actually physically move them into the profile with post-application irrigation. And that's something we need to be cognizant of when managing these diseases. A few other things to think about. We'll talk about deposition factors, application rate. These are things that are selected by the practitioner. What we have seen overwhelmingly, I think, in our work is the low rates more frequently are better than trying to go out at high rates and extend intervals, because the way the climate is, fungicides just don't persist that long in the environment. So making sure we're consistently getting out on prevention is really, really important. The timing, absolutely critical for soil-borne diseases, and we'll walk through that. And the application volume, I don't really worry about. The data has shown that you can apply in a gallon per 1,000 and be very successful, because we're going to ask you to irrigate it in with 1/8 of an inch after the fact, which is dramatically more water than increasing from a gallon to 2 gallons. Now, as I mentioned, we have what's called depletion factors. And so in our work and Dr. Lattin's work, it's clearly demonstrated that fungicides only last in the environment about 14 to 21 days from that initial application. So, i.e., that's where that lower rate more frequently comes from. They're just not as persistent as some of these other molecules. And unfortunately, there are times when our disease pressure can be so high. Especially you think of the mid-Atlantic, because the past, 2 or 3 years, a lot of the storm systems that move across the country seem to, meet in the mid-Atlantic, and disease pressure is going to be really high under those conditions. Now, one of the beauties of root diseases is most of them are not prone to resistance development. It's not that we shouldn't think about managing fungicide resistance. We always should, but I'm not as concerned about it as I am for like dollar spot or anthracnose or gray leaf spot, because these organisms, they grow very slow. They don't have multiple generations in a growing season. So we'd really have to overwhelm the system to develop resistance in these root diseases. So how do we go about doing this? This is my favorite thing to say as an academic. It's pretty easy to improve fungicide performance. Just maintain healthy turf. And usually when I say that in an audience of superintendents, I get some really dirty looks. And I'm not saying that they're not. All we're asking here is to take a step back and say, is there something else we could be doing? Can we, look at additional fertilizer? Maybe removing some more trees, addressing some drainage issues. All of those things play a big role, and we know that fungicides work. If you look at the pressure here of brown patch in this trial, if we can get a fungicide to work under that pressure, it should work at any golf course in the United States. If it's not, then something else is affecting the health of that turf. And that couples in with getting an accurate diagnosis. As Lee said, sometimes we don't find anything. Nobody wants to hear that, but a fungicide ain't going to work if there's not a fungus present. So select the best fungicide time. You see this repeating once again, and put the fungicide where that pathogen is. So let's talk a little bit about this because this goes in with management of these root diseases. What does a turf plant need to be healthy? It's really four things. It's pretty simple when we think about it: light, air, food, and water, right? And there's a number of tools to help determine, are we getting enough of all of these? Are we getting enough light? And I understand there are trees that probably can't be touched, but maybe there are some with data. Okay. And you can measure that now with various meters. Are we getting enough air into that root zone? Right. And you're probably wondering, how do we measure this? There's a number of ways. Monitor your own organic matter. If we're continually building organic matter in a system, we're not getting enough air. That air is necessary in order to break down that material, to ensure that you're getting adequate movement of your water through the putting green. Can you actually irrigate to engage the drainage, to really do a flush, is critically important. And food, one of my favorite jokes to tell growers is you actually have to open up the bag of fertilizer and put it out. You can't just show it to the plants and expect it to grow. Um, People get very upset when we start to talk about this, but I've never seen turfgrass plants struggle from having too much nitrogen. We see them struggling from having too little nitrogen. And then water, I think the industry does water management better than any other industry, but it's when Mother Nature throws us a curveball. And I think it's important to understand that rainfall, especially as extreme as they've become, acts as essentially a reset button. It charges up soil microbes. And we see in work that I did with Dr. Paul Koch years ago that after a rainfall event, fungicide persistence dramatically declines. Okay, so those are all pieces of this puzzle to be putting together. Not to reiterate what Lee said, but some diseases, yes, easily diagnosed in the field. That's why we hardly ever get brown patch, fairy ring, dollar spot, right? But many of these root diseases cannot, and that lab diagnosis is essential. Of course, I'd come out and bring my 14 sampling sticks to help anybody if you're so inclined to invite us. But the issue with these root diseases is they all appear similar from a distance. These are three different cool season root diseases: Pythium root dysfunction, summer patch, and Pythium root rot. And I always ask, in person, which one is which? And people love to say, well, I got it right. And are you willing to bank these things declining even further if you didn't? Because I'm not confident making a diagnosis of any of these based on a photo. Okay. So make sure that you do engage a reputable diagnostic lab, because it is necessary to look at these under the microscope to get a good diagnosis. Then, however, as you move forward, now you know what you're dealing with. And unless you start to see that fungicides aren't working like they were, you may not need to send in additional samples. So like Lee said, what happens if you get no disease? What now? Look at nutrient analyses, monitor your soil health, drainage, layering, black layer. If you look at this image, it's old, but this is when we had cool season grass on the coast of North Carolina. And you see these patches, right, that absolutely will have pathogenic organisms associated with it. But what's causing this is black layer. And no fungicide, nothing will remedy that until we address that particular drainage issue. When you look at this, image here, clearly this green is going to struggle with black layer and Pythium root rot. You cannot write a fungicide program that could keep this alive, right, without addressing that major limiting factor of soil drainage. And Lee showed you, we see this every year, both bent and Bermuda grass of black layer being the major issue uh, that people see in circumstances like this. So he highlighted very well, in our program, that's why we focus on these diseases, because we see them as being so problematic. You look at bentgrass from 2021, Pythium root rot, summer patch, root dysfunction, fairy ring, anthracnose. Even though anthracnose isn't technically a root disease, it's surviving in the soil. It's affecting the crown. So almost everything that we see affecting bent poa greens is essentially below ground, or at least the top 5 issues that we encounter. And so when we think about this, why is it so difficult? Why is this so challenging? Well, we've alluded to this already. The symptoms and signs are underground, so they're really difficult to early diagnose. I heard Jesse Bonelli at a recent talk say that, you can see the initial symptoms of dollar spot. You can see the initial symptoms of brown patch, and you can react and manage it within a critical time frame. We can't see that with these soil-borne diseases. About the only indication that you can get that something is wrong is looking at your dew pattern and seeing patches where maybe dew is suppressed. It's a good indication that something might be going wrong, but it doesn't necessarily equate to a soil-borne disease. I think this is the most important bullet in terms of managing soil-borne diseases. Infection and damage accrues over time. So when the symptoms show up, significant damage is already done. We may not even be able to recover from that damage. And I think that is really important to understand. So when you look at the chronology that Lee presented, we are going to ask you to manage those diseases, in many cases, 2 months before those symptoms even occur, because that's when the pathogens are active. And that's something that people really have a hard time with, I think. For example, right now, we hear it on take all root rot of Bermuda grass. Why do I see the symptoms now, but you say the fungus isn't active? Well, that's very common. Damage is done. Symptoms don't show up until the plant undergoes some sort of stress. Okay. They're not actually really aggressive pathogens by any means, right? They're affecting those plants, and those plants can make it as long as the plant doesn't undergo significant stress. Then there are significant barriers to control, right? How do we get a fungicide from that canopy to an inch, right, into that soil? Very hard with a dense layer of turf with thatch and potentially poor infiltration. And, I think part of the reason why people don't want to hear that we didn't find a disease is because they know, comparing a cost of a fungicide to drainage remediation or an extra aerification, that's going to be a headache to get done, right? That's going to require significant effort from the board, from the owner, what have you. But unfortunately, those conditions need to be remediated if we're going to be successful. And this proper placement, we can't stress enough. Okay. And so this is a cross section of a turf plug. And, the research has shown over and over again that if you're managing foliar diseases, 1 to 2 gallons per thousand is fine. We don't really actually need to get to 2 gallons per thousand, even though that's what every researcher is pretty much spraying at. There's no research evidence that demonstrates that 2 gallons is better than 1 when we're talking about brown patch, gray leaf spot, dollar spot. Okay. That what I say is whatever makes folks most efficient. Now, those of you, if you have just strictly annual bluegrass, the 2 gallons comes in if you don't want to irrigate in for things like anthracnose or even summer patch, because it can be so severe, it can be at the crown of annual bluegrass plants, right? So that's where that would come from. Now, root diseases, very different. A lot of labels say to apply in 4 to 5 gallons per 1,000 square feet, which 0 people do because that's very inefficient. And we ask you to water it in immediately if you can with 1/8 of an inch of irrigation. And if you actually do the math between 5 gallons and 1/8 of an inch, I mean, 5 gallons is tiny bit of water compared to 1/8 of an inch of irrigation immediately afterwards. And that's where we know from research we have to, or we know we can get product down to that zone. So if we look at dollar spot, for example, right, look at Secure here and 2 gallons per 1,000. Yes, we get great control, but it's better at a gallon. And it's even better at a half a gallon. Now, half a gallon would be pretty tough to do, I think, in any circumstance and get good coverage. But, a gallon, fine, right? And the contacts, that makes sense, right? You're not diluting them out. They're staying on that foliage. And you look at something that's a systemic like Maxtima, it didn't matter. 2 gallons, 1 gallon, half a gallon, it was all the same, right? All the same control, pretty much. I'm also using this slide as a reminder that we need to be cognizant of rotation, even for soil-borne diseases, because anytime we put a fungicide out, we're affecting multiple populations. We're affecting the dollar spot population. We're affecting the anthracnose population. And, we have inadvertently lost some of the SDHIs at Lake Wheeler because of using especially SDHIs to manage diseases in our trials, right? We would use Emerald to manage dollar spot in brown patch trials, and we used ProStar to manage, we use ProStar to manage brown patch in our dollar spot trials. So as you're building your fungicide programs, don't neglect these rotations, right? Because you may not build resistance to the root pathogens. You could inadvertently select for resistance in dollar spot anthracnose populations. So water volume, whatever gives you the best coverage. And I don't know about in the mid-Atlantic, but I know Dr. Lane Treadway down here for us has done some really cool demonstrations on if you go at a gallon and you get your pressure up, you get amazing coverage, right? And that's what's really most important is, are we getting good coverage of that canopy, and then turn around and irrigate it in if you're managing a root disease. So yes, unfortunately, you may have foliar applications and soil applications. And so when we get to these soil applications, that proverbial question is how much water and when. Because what maybe Lee didn't mention is all of the activity of these soil-borne diseases, they're not super deep, right? They're in that top 1 inch and in the thatch. That's where we see all of this activity. Matter of fact, when a sample comes in, it's actually quite comical to watch Lee remove all of your root material that you're very proud of, and he goes right to that interface is where these pathogens are. So this is where we need to get these fungicides. So how did we do this? And essentially what we did here was we had myclobutanil or Eagle that was tagged with a radio label. And we applied it onto a 90% sand, 10% peat by volume, right? That was packed into these containers that prevented preferential flow down the side, and imposed irrigation treatments of no irrigation, 1/8, quarter, half, and 1 inch. And what I want to draw your attention to right off the bat is even with 1 inch of irrigation, immediately afterwards, almost 50% of the myclobutanil was retained in the top 1 inch of soil. 1 inch of irrigation, right? That's a substantial amount of water. Now, what was exciting about these data was we didn't see any significant difference in movement, especially at this 1 to 2 inch depth between an eighth, quarter, half, and 1 inch, which is fantastic because that's scary to think about telling somebody you'd have to irrigate in with a half inch or an inch because that wouldn't be practical. Another thing with this study is you see very little collection, about 8 to 10% at a 2 to 3 inch depth, and literally almost zero detection at 3 to 4, and we collected nothing in the leachate. So the question that we get of can we move this stuff too far? No, we can't. Okay, you cannot move this too far. And this is a great time to talk about people have seen this, right? There are so many courses that have that one fairy ring on that one green that you can't get rid of, no matter what you do. That fairy ring fungus is probably sitting somewhere down 2 to 3 inches in that soil, right? There's some sort of layer or something down there that it's just digging life on, having a good time. How do you get rid of it? The only way you do it is basically by hand. You poke holes, right? And you essentially wash that fungicide before you get it under control. Why is that? Because with a broadcast application and even with an eighth of an inch, look, we're not getting enough material to where that organism might be. Again, that's rare, but I know there are courses that deal with this, and it's that 1 or 2 fairy rings that you have trouble controlling, because most of fairy rings activity is up in this top inch where most of the organic matter is. And, I love this particular slide because it demonstrates very efficiently the importance of irrigating in. So you have creeping bentgrass here on the left that's non-inoculated. You have creeping bentgrass on the right, inoculated with the summer patch pathogen, right? And in this case, I think this was applied, or propiconazole was applied. Both were done in the study, heritage and propiconazole. Either way, really strong summer patch materials. And look, when we didn't irrigate it in, no control with a great product. A tenth of an inch, also very little to no control. An eighth of an inch is where we started to see good control. And even though the quarter looks better, statistically, these were not different from one another, right? So this is where we landed on an eighth of an inch. And I will say one of my biggest frustrations to this day is people still say, well, how many spins of the head? How many minutes? I don't know, right? It's easy to figure out what an eighth of an inch is based on precipitation rates. And once you determine that, you will see an improved suppression of these diseases. We took this a step further, right? Because a lot of this was done in controlled conditions. And we looked at this on a creeping bentgrass putting green, right? How much is in the foliage? How much is in the thatch? And then what may get down into this particular root zone. And essentially what you'll see, number one is exciting. We looked at 3 different modes or 3 different products here. I'm only presenting the data collected for Penthiopyrad or Valista. It was exciting that we saw very little collection of the clippings, even when we didn't irrigate it in, okay? And that was different from another study conducted by our colleague, Dr. Travis Gannon, which was awesome. Hang on one second here. There we go. And, so we're not removing that with daily mowing, which was good. RAV, this is the thatch, right? What we couldn't remove with the mower and what we couldn't remove at the bottom with scissors. Let me draw your attention to, in this case, because we wanted to ensure that we were getting adequate movement, right? This was a quarter of an inch of irrigation. and still 70% of that material is in that top thatch layer, or what was not removed. This was what we termed remaining above ground vegetation. But that was statistically less than waiting 6 hours or not irrigating in at all. Moreover, look at this 0 to 1 inch depth. 30% of the material is getting down to where it needs to be with immediate versus waiting that evening or not doing anything. So folks always ask this question: if I can't do it immediately, can I irrigate it in that night? You can, right? And you see it's, statistically more material in this 0 to 1 inch depth, but it may not be enough material to keep these pathogens suppressed for 14 days compared to irrigating in immediately. All right. And that's just one thing of caution as you're doing this, that you may have to tighten your intervals if you're not able to water in immediately. Once again, almost zero detection at 2 to 3 inches, right? And we detected nothing below 3 inches when turf is in this particular system. So we can't move these materials too far. And the incorporations of wetting agents also are really important. What we found in this study is, if you look at this 2 to 3 inch depth, we were getting 8 to 12% when we didn't have a wetting agent, and now we're approaching 20%, right? But what we found in this study was it takes 2 weeks to work based on our experiments, all right, which is absolutely important to understand, because you can't just go out and tank mix the fungicide without having that soil already conditioned with that wetting agent. So these wetting agent programs, based on our work, seem to be really, really important. We've also noticed, just from our own farm manager, that a lot of these products don't last much longer than 2 to 3 weeks, especially during the summer months. So these wetting agent programs that folks are talking about, I think, are critically important for the management of these soil-borne diseases. So when we start talking about percentages, you're probably wondering, well, we're only getting like 30% of the material to where it needs to be. Is that enough? And yes, it absolutely is enough. For these organisms, Pythium, summer patch, take-all, fairy ring fungi, they're ultra sensitive to fungicides. And you look at, this is work we did with the take-all root rot pathogen, or one of them on Bermuda grass, and 1 part per million completely suppresses the growth of the fungus. And so when you look at immediate versus waiting, you see the differences here in the RAV and then this upper inch of soil. Why I say you may not get as long a control if you wait, right? You have less material there over time, right? It still may be enough depending on the environment, but you're running a risk if you're not irrigating in immediately. And just to demonstrate that you're not losing protection in the foliage, this was a study we did irrigating in segue and union for foliar blight, of Pythium foliar blight in perennial ryegrass. And you see no difference between foliar and irrigated in with union or segue, right? And here is, union 2.9 fluid ounces irrigated in versus the non-treated controls. Now, this isn't something we would suggest, but, when you're building programs, you need to be thinking about, okay, what is this bringing to the table? If I'm irrigating in for Pythium root rot, well, you're getting Pythium blight suppression. On top of the fact that we also ask that you continue with your phosphonate or phosphite program. Check the box again for Pythium blight protection. So to summarize this, I'll bring these all in quickly, that yes, we do need to think about post-application irrigation. All of the trials you're going to see from here on out, they'll be watered in with 1/8 of an inch of water. Okay. And they're done immediately. And so it's important that we try to implement those practices. Now, some folks have asked about, do fungicides run off? And, when we look at our greens, they're flat, but golf course greens are very undulated. And, there's very limited work done in the mid Atlantic and the Southeast on this, but work done in the North when they look at snow mold fungicides on fairways, what they found was even with precipitation for 109 minutes at a rate of 1.4 inches an hour, less than 5% of flutalanyl or PCNB was detected in runoff. So, no, fungicides don't seem to run off slopes and collect in the bottom of areas, even though that's been implied from some folks visiting golf courses out there. The data does not support that. And in this case, the soil moisture was maintained at 37%, which nobody does. Okay, this is worst case scenario. It really does demonstrate how sticky these fungicides are, right? That once they bind to an organic surface, they don't move. So let's move into Pythium root rot here. Okay, so Pythium root rot, primarily a putting green disease, right? The problem with this particular disease, but also the benefit, is many species cause the disease. And why is that a problem? Well, that means we have a complex of, this is why we talk about preventing infection early and then continuing as these other organisms ebb and flow through the season. But the benefit is the selection pressure for resistance is much less because you're not managing the same population each time you're putting out a fungicide. The other thing that we have noticed is we used to say hot and wet, but if you remember from Lee's chronology, almost every year we can see Pythium root rot pop up in March if we get wet conditions and it's relatively warm, 60-degree soil temperatures. We're not asking that you start slinging Segway and Serrata at that time, but this is very important to think about multiple diseases and what are we getting the best bang for our buck. And we'll come back to that. And annual bluegrass, creeping bentgrass, definitely considered some of the more susceptible grasses, but we see this on warm season grasses as well. Absolutely get a laboratory diagnosis. I would say still Pythium root rot is a disease that many may not consider as that big of an issue, but it really, truly is. I mean, if anything's rotting the crown and primary roots like this, it's going to be bad for the home team, that these plants are not going to grow. And more importantly, by ignoring a diagnosis and we allow these oospores to develop, one of the things we didn't talk about with root diseases is their inoculum builds over time. And there are plenty of times when the inoculum is so great that it may take a golf course superintendent multiple years to overcome it. And the reason why is because of the deposition of these spores. They live in soil for 8 to 10 years. So do make sure you get these things accurately diagnosed. So you look at healthy roots versus roots affected with Pythium root rot. Notice the color difference, right? A little bit of anaerobic conditions. It's darker, slimy. And, you could probably see this just by pulling out your own profiles and maybe even washing away some of the roots. So when do we manage this? This study was set out by a student of ours, Hallie Hampy, where we looked at applying from March 14th to July 3rd, right? And then going on the back end and correlating back to soil temperature. Why did we start way back over here? Well, if you remember another disease called Pythium root dysfunction, March 14th is typically when we start to get to about 50 to 55 degree soil temperatures. And what we were thinking is, well, Pythium velutum, yes, can cause Pythium root dysfunction, but is also a really good pathogen and cause Pythium root rot. So what would this look like if we started that early? We started April 10th or May 8th, right? And what did we end up seeing? All these treatments, except for starting in July, were effective. And this is critically important because it demonstrates that curative control for Pythium root rot is just not good, right? And we're not going to win that particular battle. Now, you may be honing in very quick, those of you watching, well, you're saying to go out maybe in May, but June 4th did just fine. And, it really did. And I think we were lucky in this particular year, but look at June 13th. We already have significantly more Pythium root rot than starting in April or May, right? And what happens if this was trafficked? Or keep in mind, we mow our greens at 145. If you're mowing at 110, this could be enhanced dramatically, right? So this idea of prevention, so important. And so what did we find as far as soil temperature start date, right? Let me back up one here. If you look at 50 degrees on March 4th, yeah, it's maybe a tiny bit early for segue, right? Even though we had good control throughout the season, right? But what I want you to think about, right, when really about 75-degree soil temperatures might be the optimal time to start the segue, or now I'll show you serrata. What's happening back when these soil temperatures are at 60 to 65 degrees? And this is where we're thinking about, how can I get suppression of Pythiums, summer patch, take-all patch, and preventative fairy ring applications, right? And where I think maybe we've gotten lost some there is looking at like DMI, QOI combinations to start the season, right? If you started with something that has the DMI, QOI, you're getting suppression of every one of those diseases for the most part, right? QOIs are actually halfway decent for Pythium root rot control because we're suppressing some of those early populations. And we see this in our fungicide program research in trials that definitely starting with you think of, Brisquays, Navicons, Tartans of the world, providing exceptional way to start the season because you're getting every one of those diseases. And then you come back, 28 days later, and hey, you're still within this window. And yeah, you can throw a segue or serrata in with that, and it's an amazing suppression of all of these soil-borne diseases. And then you move into suppressing root rot throughout the summer months. The other caution as I get into summer patch is also affecting these roots the same time that Pythium root rot is. So continuing with a Pythium control with potentially some of these newer DMIs and QOIs is an optimal way to go. So prevention, when we start early, in this case, we started this on May 21st, Union, segue, flawless, okay? And at the low rates. This is where we have come to this, and we don't see the low rates outperforming the high rates in any facet of our research, right? So 0.45 or 2.9, gonna be absolutely amazing. Then, of course, some of you may have heard about the introduction of serrata or picarbutrazox, brand new novel mode of action, which is absolutely exciting on our end because this is a perfect rotation with segue, right? And once again, 0.6 ounces, just as good as 1 ounce, right? So when we use these in conjunction with one another, we see amazing suppression of Pythium root rot. Uh, Matter of fact, at our field day last year, we had a lot of people saying, "Oh man, why wouldn't we look at creeping bentgrass in our area again?" Well, we do have the tools necessary to prevent this if we use them appropriately. And in this trial, this was started about May 15th, and we're just getting amazing results with these alternations. Now, curatively, if you get caught, that's where potentially the high rate that we see here with Segway, but it's still not great. And somebody will ask, well, what about the curative potential of Serrata? It's very good, but that's a very quick way to develop resistance because remember, these populations, if we're going at it curatively, that's a pretty big selection pressure to go at it with a high rate, right? So look at these things on a preventative basis. And both Segway and Serrata provide excellent suppression of Pythium blight. And just on a little aside, people still worry about Pythium blight, and it's such a rare disease on golf course putting greens, even native soil putting greens, right? We see it in fairways, right? You see it in roughs, but it's not really a major issue of golf course putting greens, right? So a couple key things, to consider with Pythium root rot, yeah, Serrata has now become the king of the block, but we're only allowed 4 applications. So we do need to use it in rotation with Segway. What I haven't mentioned yet are the phosphonates are still critical, right? Signature and Appear do improve the efficacy of these programs, right? And the other phosphites may also be effective, right? And you can even tank mix if you desired a phosphite or phosphonate with Subdue or Banol to increase their efficacy, right? But don't discount how important these phosphonates are. Until Serrata was released, the way we ranked Pythium root rot control was Segway, phosphonates, Subdue, then Banol. Okay. Now it's Serrata, Segway, phosphonates, then Subdue and Banol, right? And some folks get mad when we say that about Subdue or Banol, but it makes sense. They're old chemistry, and we have detected in our research isolates that have levels of insensitivity to it. Okay, so that's a lesson of why we must rotate with Segway and Serrata to ensure that we protect these things for the life of the product. Now, summer patch, okay? You might be wondering, like, summer patch, and you've been talking about it on creeping bentgrass. Well, it is a major issue of creeping bentgrass, and it presents itself in many different ways. Most people have trouble dealing with this being summer patch because it's small little spots or patches, because we're ingrained to think of summer patch of having a ring-like appearance. And yeah, that can happen, but remember, that's why we call those textbook symptoms, okay? And we've seen this all over the country, summer patch being diagnosed, and a lot of it actually in the mid-Atlantic on creeping bentgrass putting greens. I think it is grossly misdiagnosed as take-all patch. And I've heard this of, well, I did my preventative take-all patch applications, but I'm still getting take-all patch. That don't work that way. If you're seeing that, it's most likely summer patch, because this organism starts to infect when soil temperatures are 65 degrees, and it continues to infect until soil temperatures get to about 90 degrees. So it is definitely a summertime issue. Lee Miller has documented this when he was in the Midwest on creeping bentgrass. You see symptoms here. Walking through the plug of roots, totally affected here, and you see these vascular cylinders, necrotic, and in the tissue, you see these growth cessation structures. Okay. And so if you deal with what you may consider as just very difficult to control take-all, ask the diagnostician if they saw growth cessation structures. If they don't know what you're talking about, then it may be time to look at a new lab. So what can we do? One of the most important things, especially for take-all patch and now summer patch, is incorporating the micronutrient manganese. This was work done by John Inguagiato, and you'll notice that the aerification, had some effects, especially the holotine under no manganese. But once you implement a manganese treatment, we get amazing suppression of summer patch. So I want you to think about that and this idea of holotine aerification. Even though there is, discussion out there now of not aerifying putting greens, they saw a significant improvement in or at least lessening of summer patch severity under holotine aerification in the absence of manganese. And you see that in these particular plots. So what works? Okay. And once again, what I want you to be thinking about, remember I said 65-degree soil temperature is when it starts. Okay. And we can get a lot of different organisms by picking the appropriate products. So if we look at these data here, you see, Heritage, Honor, Lexicon, Exemplar doing quite well to suppress summer patch in Dr. Bruce Clark's trials. So of this, think of a Lexicon giving you broad suppression of, fairy ring, summer patch, Pythium root rot because of the insignia, and giving you suppression of take-all patch through the insignia as well. But then there are others to consider, like Brisquay doing very well, Headway. I mean, it's really hard to beat these early DMI QOI applications when you're talking about broad spectrum control. We see Heritage still performing exceptionally well. Those of you I know who might be dealing with summer patch and roughs, potentially even fairways, there are products that are more affordable out there, like Honor, where you have, emerald and insignia mixed together. And think about that too, because that could be an excellent way to suppress dollar spot, especially, early in the year. Okay, so lots of things out there to control this particular disease. The key thing, accurate diagnosis, anything you can do. And, this says summer patch management, but this is summarizing every soil-borne disease. Get an accurate diagnosis. Do whatever you can to promote root growth. If that means subtly raising mowing heights in the summer, looking at aerification, venting, whatever it might be, maintaining your fertilization. On cool season greens, you can look towards, an ammonium sulfate-based fertilization program, right? And, for fungicides, for summer patch, target a 65-degree soil temperature threshold. But even thinking, at 55 degrees for preventative fairy ring, what can I apply to do that? And take-all patch. And hey, give me some Pythium root rot suppression. And then my next application, what am I going to get summer patch with? Okay. And to be quite honest, that's where those DMI QOI combos are really hard to beat early in the season. Just to show you it can be overcome, even curatively. I love these. This was from a superintendent who sent these to me a number of years ago from Waco, Texas, where he was managing creeping bentgrass, got these beautiful summer patch symptoms. applied Brisquay in the heat of the summer, right? Because some folks still seem to be a little cautious of Brisquay, Maxtima, Densicor. And, I think we really need to move away from the term cooling DMIs. They don't make the plants any cooler. They just don't have that same effect on the plant as propiconazole or Eagle or tridiconazole can. So Brisquay applied at 0.725, watered in on the 17th of July and the 25th, exceptional summer patch control, even curatively. Not something we would suggest, but they had not dealt with it before. And then, of course, I'm sure subsequent years they built it into their rotation. I also probably wouldn't have suggested mixing ammonium sulfate in with it, but they did. So, just some general considerations as you look through this. I know they wanted us to talk about fairy ring as well, and everybody's seen fairy ring. The key thing is monitoring those soil temperatures. And what we have noticed, in the Carolinas is, yes, those conditions for fairy ring initial colonization of that organic matter may be longer than what we think. That we can't just make 2 calendar applications and expect to get 100% preventative control, right? That we may need 3 preventative applications. On Bermuda grass, we actually need 4 in our regions to be successful. And when we have wet years, you need a curative application in the summertime. And that may be not necessarily when you see fairy ring, right? But think about if we've been very wet and you're getting to about July, that's when fairy ring symptoms like to show up. You're going out with a soil-borne application most likely anyway for Pythium root rot in summer patch. So use something that's going to give you fairy ring suppression there as well. The Valista has also been quite good. Exemplar, right? A number of things that we can do. Okay. So the other one I didn't address is Pythium root dysfunction. And that disease is primarily a problem on new construction. And really almost exclusively new construction in a lot of situations. So if you have new construction, one of the things we would suggest now is, especially these new cultivars, they look great after you seed them. They come in, they look amazing, they're vibrant and aggressive, and we don't put any fungicides on them during these infection windows, especially in the fall of the year. Okay. And it's important that we do that right out of the gate. These pathogens are already there. We have to assume that they're there and waiting. So start in the fall, right? When those soil temperatures start to decline to about 70 degrees, thinking of, a QOI, DMI, hey, saying it again, or Segway or Serrata even, but the QOIs work very, very well on root dysfunction. So with that, we don't hide from anybody. If you need to contact us, here we are. And again, it was a pleasure to talk to you today about our work. Thank you.
That was awesome, guys. Thank you so much for that presentation. It's really helpful information. We are recording this and it will be posted on our on-demand section of our website. But beyond, on behalf of Landscape Supply, Walker Supply, 10 Barge, we'd sincerely like to thank you guys for your cooperation and time and presentation. And please reach out to these guys at NC State if you guys need some support, especially the turf lab. I'm not sure there's a better lab in the country than the one down at NC State. So we'll attach the lab submission form as well to all the customers that are on the line today. So Thank you guys again, and I appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your week.
No problem, and we'll send you these slides shortly after this.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.